what is your overall motivation for writing this book? Or do you have a specific motivation for your choice of storyline or your choice of genre?
There are kind of three different genres that I've always enjoyed reading. Science fiction, fantasy, obviously, and historical fiction as well. And so I've kind of dabbled in all three of those. But probably about 14 years ago, I had this crazy idea which essentially became the World of Pangea. And it was this epic scene that kept replaying in my head, this battle between good and evil. And, the challenges that people would have to face. What is really good? What is really evil? What is my part to play in this? How can I judge what is bad, what is right? And this novel kind of came out of that. So to say I have a specific motivation might be too specific a thing to say, but I certainly think that in every great story, as with every great piece of music or great piece of art that you see, there is some kind of truth in it that somehow tugs at the human soul or tugs at the human heart. And my hope is that in this novel, I've kind of collected strands together that will tug at your heart, that will help you relate to it, connect to it, and realize that, yeah, okay, there are things in a fantasy novel that can apply to my life. There are things in a fantasy novel that bring me joy, that bring me sadness, that help me think about how I live my life. And I think it's fair to say that in every good story that you read or that you hear, that occurs.
And how long did it take you to write?
That's a good question. I began, as I think I mentioned earlier, my first idea for this book was when I was 17 or 18. And I remember going around college talking about this guy called Xylon. And I had this scene in my head where it began with Xylon ran. He ran because he had to, really cliche stuff. But it created this world which was, at the time I was trying to be Terry Pratchett, which I am not Terry Pratchett. And a tip for any would-be authors out there, don't try and be another author. You got to learn how to be yourself. And I was trying to be this Terry Pratchett, but I did come up with this overarching theme which I carried on into Pangea. And I wrote a couple of scenes throughout the next decade, between 18 and about 28. And then when I was about 29, 30, just a couple of years ago, I entered NaNoWriMo. And I know anybody who wants to write, you're probably very familiar with NaNoWriMo. It's this competition where you try and write 50,000 words in a month. And so I entered it and was like, I can combine these scenes together and I can make a story out of this. And so I did, and used that to then spur me on to complete it. And so I would say intentional writing, about 2 years. 1 year of writing the story, 1 year of rewrites, and I've rewritten almost every chapter in this novel. Probably a good 70-75% of them have been rewritten in some shape or form. So that process took another year.
Michael, tell me what the planning process for writing this novel was like. Did it sort of just flow as you went along, or did you have a detailed outline to start with?
I think every author will tell you that we love those times where the inspiration hits us, the muse hits us, and you can just write for hours and hours. And, sometimes I finish the day and I've done 5,000 to 10,000 words, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what have you done? Now, of course, you go back and you edit those and you rewrite sentences. But there are times where it's difficult, and you kind of have to plow through. And so one of the most important things for a writer is that you dedicate time each day to writing. There's an author called Malcolm Gladwell, and he examined what it took to make someone great at something. And he said that it would take 10,000 hours to become great at something. And so if you think about that, if you're a wannabe writer, if you want to be an author, it's going to take 10,000 hours of writing to become proficient at it. So the most important thing is to do that. For me personally, parts of this novel were very inspirational, and I just wrote them very fluently and very fluidly. But what happened was I began with several scenes, as I think I talked about. Actually, the first scene I ever wrote was the second to last scene in the novel. It's in the last chapter. And I was like, what is going on here? And then the second scene I wrote was the first one. And I thought, there's a story arc. These two are connected somehow. And so then I planned out the 11 chapters, and I planned out roughly what the main points in each chapter were. But I think it's also really important that I let the characters write for themselves. And that always seems really strange. If you don't write fiction, let the characters write for themselves. I always joke around that, if you don't write fiction, it sounds schizophrenic. But there's a truth to that. Your character has a life of their own. And so they sometimes, as you develop them, you want them to make one decision, but it just doesn't fit who they are. And they make a different decision, which then sparks an idea for a subplot or a catalyst for a new action point in the novel. So I'd say it was a long process, and it was very interactive, and sometimes it was difficult, sometimes it was easy.
Tell me how you kept yourself motivated while you were writing this novel.
Well, from a young age, I wanted to publish something. And so I'm like, if I don't finish this one, then it could be like 2 or 3 other novels that I've started and not finished, but now will one day. And so I think part of my motivation is I've got a dream and I need to accomplish it. Part of my motivation is I wanted something to show my kids when they grow up. You know, I wanted to write a book that I enjoyed reading, and therefore one that I believe my kids will enjoy reading. And so I did that. I remember reading a conversation between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien once, where one of them said to the other, you know, I think we're going to have to write the books we want to read because there's none out there. And so obviously there are fantasy novels out there I like, but I wanted to add to that and say, here's a book I like, I've written it myself, but I still enjoy reading it.
Do you remember when you first started writing? Is this something that you've always loved to do? And can you remember what your very first story was?
I feel like I've been writing most of my life, and the first story that I remember writing was in grade 3, and we were given the task of writing a 1-page story, and we had a couple of lessons to do this in. I got really into it, and I started writing this story that essentially became a novel, honestly. Not a publishable novel, definitely aimed at kids, and it was about this villain called Wally Wombat, and about these friends who went on a quest to find a treasure island. I think I just finished reading Treasure Island, probably. And so I wrote this novel about a treasure island and this villain who wanted to stop them getting there. I never completed it, but what I ended up doing was asking my teacher if I could take the exercise book we were writing in home. And so I continued writing this story at home, and then we'll bring it back to class. And then they let me read it in class one time, and I'd filled the exercise book. It was meant to be 1 page, and I'd filled it. And I think that's when I realized I love this. I love these stories. I love writing them, and I love reading them.
In the novel, do you intentionally pay homage to any other authors? Or are there motivations that come specifically from other works by other authors?
There was nothing deliberate in the novel where I deliberately said, hey, I'm going to write this in here to reference this particular author or book. However, I would say Christopher Paolini's Eragon, there is an elfin city in that series that certainly influenced my description of the immortal city that you read about in this novel, in the first novel. Also, I think anyone who writes fantasy these days is influenced in some way by Lord of the Rings. Tolkien created such a vast world and introduced even the concept of the modern fairy tale, which is essentially what fantasy is. And so there's certainly going to be an influence from there. I like to think that how I wrote my novel was similar to C.S. Lewis in some respects, where he said he had a scene, he would write out this scene, and then he would think, oh, how does this connect to this other story that I'm thinking about? And certainly the way that my novel began was with scenes that I wrote, and then thought, these connect somehow. How do these connect? There's a story to be told there. And then I told it.